We have two amazing speakers for lunch. We're just thrilled to have Vicki Arroyo and Dr. Beverly Wright joining us. We have switched the order for some logistical reasons, and so Vicki is going to be going first. So just so you understand how the day goes, we have our two lunchtime speakers, and then we will be going into breakout sessions from approximately 2 to 4 o'clock, and before we break, we'll tell you what's in which room, although it is on your agenda. And then at 4, we'll come back together here for a reception, which will give you lots of opportunity to get to know each other more and to have opportunities to chat. So I'm going to hand it over to Jim Bach, who is the Chief Operating Officer, well, here I am introducing you, of the Louis Berger Group, a member of our advisory committee, and a great friend of and alumnus of Rutgers University.
Jean just took the first part of what I was going to say. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to present our first of the lunchtime speakers, Vicki Arroyo. She is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center of Georgetown University Law Center, where she is also a visiting professor. And she's developed a national reputation for being able to combine environmental law with her background in biology and ecology to help prepare all of us for climate change. Ms. Arroyo was previously with the Pew Center, where she had a whole lot of different jobs, was the Vice President for Domestic Policy and General Counsel, and involved with the Pew Center on global climate change. And when you get a chance, visit TED Talks on the website, because in 2012, Vicki gave a great presentation on climate change that also included some of her personal ties to New Orleans and the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So I very much recommend that to you. But we actually have her here in person right now. So with that, Vicki Arroyo.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Yeah. People still have energy. That's great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. We love working with Rutgers. I can't go on and on about being at Rutgers or being from Rutgers, but I can tell you we love working with Rutgers at Georgetown, Jean and Marjorie and the whole team, and look forward to much, much more. So I'm really happy to be part of this event. As you heard in the introduction, I, too, like Margaret and everybody else, has some nexus with disaster. It's not just our day jobs. And so while I know that the efforts here are very focused on Sandy relief, I want to take you back a little bit to the year of the hurricane, 2005. In the region that I'm from, South Louisiana, was the year of the hurricane. You might recall that that year saw 7 major storms affecting the U.S. We had so many hurricanes that season that we ran out of letters of our alphabet and had to go pretty deep into the Greek alphabet, if you might recall. This one, for a time, was the largest hurricane measured in the Gulf of Mexico and one of the strongest Category 5s ever recorded, with gusts up to 235 miles per hour. And its approach to my home state of Louisiana and Texas prompted the largest evacuation ever in history. And it was a killer storm that killed people in 4 states. But it might not be the storm that you're thinking about, because if you look at the bottom, it says September 22nd, whereas Katrina happened in late August, as you recall. This was Hurricane Rita, which happened within just a few weeks of New Orleans' devastation in Katrina. And together, collectively, with 80% of New Orleans inundated in Katrina and Rita, it was a 1-2 punch that cost over $100 billion in that state and in that region. And of course, the human toll from Katrina and Rita is well known. Almost 2,000 lives lost in both of these disasters, over 300,000 homes lost. These are 2 from my immediate family. That is my mother's home at the top in Gentilly. And as you can see, it's a single-story building, which doesn't leave a lot of room for evacuation. So when the floodwaters were up to the roof, fortunately, my mother was gone. She had evacuated. But other people in the neighborhood were not so lucky and had really no place to go. And so some of the deaths that happened in New Orleans, in Gentilly, which is a racially diverse neighborhood, middle-class kind of neighborhood, a lot of them perished, a lot of older people especially, who couldn't really fight their way out of the attic, and the roof perished. when they had not evacuated. But as you heard earlier, evacuations themselves have cost, and I have a personal story about that too. The year before Hurricane Katrina, my mother and father left the same house in Gentilly and evacuated when Hurricane Ivan, which you might recall, in 2004, everybody thought that would be the big one to hit New Orleans, and so they evacuated. He was turned away from a hospital for a heart test that had been ordered by his doctors because in general, the hospitals try to sort of, shut down except for emergencies so that people don't all come there and want to eat there and use their generators. And so he never made it back to this house in Gentilly. He went directly from the hotel where they had evacuated to the hospital and died the year before Katrina. So I understand why people don't want to evacuate and why people fear for those who do, but I also obviously understand with my own family saved because they evacuated a year later in Katrina. My mother, my sister, and her husband, my aunt, and my uncle, who all lost their homes, that it's very important to try to promote evacuation and to get it done right and to save lives. And of course, while Katrina affected my family directly, as you can see from my sister's before and after house, and she lived on Bel Air Drive, which was the very first street near the 17th Street Canal breach. That was the breach that pushed houses really off their foundations. When they moved in with me in Arlington and my son, they came with gas cans in the back of their car when they were rolling up. And I was ironically giving interviews with my day job hat on, working on climate change with people sort of making connections with Rita on the way and Katrina that had just happened. And they drove in with gas cans in their cars because, as you recall, we were all suffering with, in some cases, long lines, depending on where you were from, or shortages of certainly higher prices after Katrina for a while. More than 100 oil platforms that you see in this picture, so many of them, but 100 of them were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 500 pipelines were down, and 9 refineries were down. And you see the important location of the Henry Hub. And this reminds me of Margaret's slide earlier with Louisiana being such an important port and for trucking as well. So again, these shortages can have a national economic impact, and in fact, an international economic impact. Some people have linked some of the tortilla riots in Mexico in part to the spike in prices after Katrina. But it wasn't a one-time event because, as you can see, it wasn't that long afterwards that we saw the paths of other billion-dollar storms, Gustav and Ike, hit this region hard again. And as you've heard, and you'll hear a bit more from me, given our center's work experience now with Vermont rebuilding after Hurricane Irene, from the Carolinas to New England, saw a lot of devastation with Hurricane Irene. Isaac, which might not spring to mind as a big storm, but it really did affect Louisiana quite a bit last year. You might recall this was the one that was heading to the Republican convention, and they delayed it a bit, but they restarted it after the storm passed in time for us to all watch Clint Eastwood talk to an empty chair. It went on to hit South Louisiana again, and even though it was only a Category 1 storm, it did quite a bit of damage, about 60,000 houses. They had flooding, they had storm surge in Laplace, and it was over $1 billion worth of damage. And then, of course, not long after that, you all experienced Sandy, the largest Atlantic hurricane ever recorded, the deadliest storm since Katrina, affecting 24 states. I'm using some of the same slides from NOAA that Margaret did, so I'll flip through this one, but this shows the number of these billion-dollar weather disasters on the rise through 2011, and that doesn't even include the big drought that affected half of the nation's counties, and Sandy. And this one too, because it's an international phenomenon, it's not just a US phenomenon, with weather disasters on the rise vis-a-vis other geological events like, geophysical events, I should say, like earthquakes, for example, which are remaining pretty constant. So I think this is to say that while many elected officials and others would like to tell you a reassuring lie, as we say in my family after Katrina, it is what it is. This is reality. This is what we're facing. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And in fact, what are our officials doing at the various levels of government? And so in addition to telling you a little bit about what state and locals are doing, I wanted to point out to you, in case you're not aware of it, that the U.S. Government Accounting Office just recently added climate change to the list of high risks in the United States. Because, as we know, the government always acts as insurer. They act as insurer for crops, for disaster relief, for flood insurance programs, purposes. And a recent study by the Center for American Progress makes it clear that, in a way, we're all insurers, because they estimate that from these recent disasters, we've spent each household, not $1, $2, $3, but $400 paying for the cost of these disasters. So what's being done? I'm happy to say that there has been a start made, and it's really just a start, as I think they will acknowledge. A number of federal climate action adaptation plans came out this year. We reviewed it and commented. Hopefully some of you did as well. And I just point out a couple of them here for highlights, but the Department of Homeland Security recognized the risks of the future climate looking different and has asked FEMA to revisit its mission regarding disaster resilience with climate change in mind. They've also identified the fact that that open Arctic that we heard about earlier is going to pose some challenges for the Coast Guard in terms of monitoring it, that our borders might have to be monitored more as other countries struggle, immigration, diseases coming into the country, all kinds of things. The Commerce Department has directed NOAA to provide training on coastal resilience, and on and on. So these are worth taking a look at and engaging with the federal agencies. In the meantime, 19 states have either developed climate adaptation plans or are doing efforts something like this in some cases, or sometimes more of a top-down approach to adaptation and planning. And so there is a lot of discussion going on. And you probably can't see this in the back of the room, but it's just to make the point that a lot of the sectors that are covered are pretty consistent from one plan to another, as you can imagine. Biodiversity for the coastal states, the coastal areas are covered, forestry, infrastructure is often covered. And so it's worth looking at some of these other plans that are out there, and this information is available on our website. And it's also worth knowing, I think, that some of these were initiated from a top-down process, where often it was governors who, through an executive order, decided that we need to move forward with adaptation planning. And this happened in states like Alaska under then-Governor Palin, under Governor Schwarzenegger, another Republican in California, Governor Christ in Florida. So we've had a bipartisan effort, really historically, in this country on state support for adaptation. And we have some states that have taken on legislation, which is good in a way, because then that can really, hopefully, continue these exercises even when you have a change at the gubernatorial level. And then you have some bottom-up approaches, like you see here, which has worked in Minnesota and some other places, where universities and other stakeholders have partnered to try to develop plans. And in addition to this effort, I'm aware of an effort that DEP and Sustainable Jersey has, not necessarily for a plan per se, but to work together on adaptation. So there are different models. Our home state of Louisiana tends not to talk about climate change. It tends to talk about sea level rise, but without really deciding, what might have prompted that. So they are looking at sea level rise in the context of the Coastal Restoration Plan. I'm happy to say they're at least acknowledging it. And on the ground, you can look at specific instances where they are rebuilding differently after Katrina. For example, the I-10 twin spans with sections knocked out in Katrina have been rebuilt 21 feet higher to allow for greater storm surge, and that's in Lake Pontchartrain. Charity Hospital, the sort of one-stop shop for a lot of the public needs. It was basically primary care for many, many people in New Orleans before the storm, and was very adversely affected by the storm. And the little map is to show that all roads led to Charity in terms of lots of the transportation infrastructure, a lot of the MTA, the buses, and all of that. Charity did a remarkable job of keeping people alive under really dire circumstances. The nurses and doctors and others there really saved a lot of lives in really harrowing circumstances during Katrina. But then afterwards, you see where Charity was relative to other hospitals and the population. And with that out of the mix for now, and there's been some arbitration panel that's been trying to decide, how that money is going to be spent, and it will be rebuilt in some form or fashion. But in the meantime, the city also worked to put these little neighborhood medical centers, community homes, medical homes into the neighborhoods where population was coming back and they needed primary care. And they were able to do this because they got some flexibility in spending their HUD dollars. And so the point being that it's not always easy to get this flexibility after a disaster, but it's really important when you can do this, and then you don't have a one-stop shop that might be out of commission. You have some diversification, you have some redundancy in your system, you also have some choice of where people can go. And so I'm hoping that some of the things that have happened, like these medical homes, will be able to continue even after the traditional disaster funding streams have gone away. The schools were obviously adversely affected too, with 80% of the population underwater, as you can imagine. And they didn't know for a time which neighborhoods were going to come back or where, who was going to come back. It was the beginning of the school year when Katrina hit. And so a lot of people had to pull their kids and start them somewhere else in school, Florida or Houston, wherever they happen to be. And so again, the city petitioned the federal government for flexibility because, as you know, FEMA often wants to basically give you money to make you whole, to put facilities right back in the same place in the same way, and that just didn't make sense. So as you can see from this article, which actually was from August 2010, it shows you how long it took, but they were successful in ultimately getting a lump sum of money that they could use to rebuild schools differently in some cases, and in some cases in different places. This happens to be my elementary school that was rebuilt, but it just really reopened last year, so it has been a very long and drawn-out process. This is a picture of the infamous Green Dot Plan that came from the Urban Land Institute and some earlier sort of top-down conversations early on about the rebuilding and where people should live and where they shouldn't live. And you can imagine if you were under a green dot, like some of these neighborhoods, you might have a very different opinion of whether or not your particular ancestral home might be the place that is basically given up to floodwaters. Although, you know, we all, from hearing these conversations, know that the water has to find a place to go. We have to deal with some of these very difficult decisions. But there was a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, to this kind of top-down green dot approach. What you did see, though, being more successful were some on-the-ground efforts, neighborhood by neighborhood, to bring people back. In the Broadmoor neighborhood, which was under one of those green dots, in my sister's neighborhood, where a neighbor of hers, Denise Thornton, started this group called Beacons of Hope, where they really tried to figure out what it took to get back on your feet and rebuild or rebuild differently. And then they actually sort of took that model and started working with other neighborhoods, like my mom's neighborhood in Gentilly and so on. You might recognize Wendell Pierce, the actor from Treme. He's a friend from high school, and he's working to bring back his Pontchartrain Park neighborhood, bring back fresh groceries and the like in that area. And more recently, you actually see some interest in using some of the now vacant lots, vacant for quite some time now, to do things like retain water more successfully in the event of future, smaller storms, but very frequent rain that we see there through these kind of designs. And I'm happy to say that FEMA is funding a planning process to allow the neighborhood to figure out whether or not some of these might work and to really show that there's a cost-benefit case that's to be made. And so you sort of see like a green dot process from the other end, a bottom-up kind of green dot process emerging. In Irene, many roads, 2,000 local segments were affected, and 200 miles of state highway segments were affected in Vermont, and New York was obviously hit hard as well. Vermont actually had some experience before the storm with doing things like raising the seabed and restoring natural floodplains, and they found that the areas where they had done that actually fared better in the storm than those that they had not. So they set about replacing some of the culverts that blew out, like the one that you see here, or the bridges that were knocked down because the scour literally took out the bridge from underneath with taking the soil out from either side. And so they went to these arched culverts that would allow for fish passage, they would allow for more water to pass, they would really sort of bolster and harden the bridge for future flooding, the likes that we think that we'll see in the future. But unfortunately, they've had a really hard time getting reimbursed for FEMA for these investments. They do have rules on the books that say this is how they want to design in the future, this is their new design standard. But because they show some site-related flexibility, FEMA has interpreted that as not requiring it, and therefore, when Vermont has gone in and put this in at the cost of millions and millions of dollars, FEMA's position has historically been, we're not going to pay it. This is starting to change one by one culvert for about $100,000 in a small town has been approved, but you can imagine these small towns, they have maybe a budget of $800,000. A culvert replacement is a really big deal. So we have to figure out a way to make sure that our policies and our laws are tailored to being able to rebuild with climate change in mind so we don't keep throwing good money after bad, and it hasn't been easy. You have heard, though, about some of the design competitions in San Francisco and in New York City to try to allow for rising water, sea level rise. But still, it's easier to do hard armoring permits for a seawall like this one than to do what Maryland, for example, is trying to do along the Chesapeake Bay with more wetlands and green soft armoring solutions. And that's because there's a general permitting process that the Army Corps allows for the hard armoring that goes pretty quickly. But they see these other soft armoring solutions as more of an exception, and they have to individualize them, and so therefore it can take a lot more time. So it could take from days into years. And so this is the kind of thing that also has to change. And happily, some states like Alabama and Maryland are starting to work on ways that they can streamline these processes so we can support some soft armoring solutions. As you've heard from folks today, we are clear about one impact of climate change along with sea level rise, and that is global warming will bring more heat. And these are projections both at a low emission scenario and a high emission scenario. And I think the value of these is not just to tell us what we might be in store for in terms of heat and how to adapt to it, but hopefully it will get the attention of some policymakers, because I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily want to live in that quadrant over here or have kids or grandkids who do. So I'm hoping that these scenarios can actually help people realize that the emissions that you put into the atmosphere still really make a difference as to which scenario we are adapting to. And of course, we've already seen cities like Chicago that have had lethal rounds of summer heat waves that killed many people and led to them becoming a leader after they had to turn refrigerator trucks from the popular Taste of Chicago Festival into makeshift morgues after several people died in 1995. So they started putting in green infrastructure, green roofs, cool roofs, and really making themselves a leader in this way. And you see here them juxtaposed by the city's roof, the green roof, next to the Cook County roof, and it's a 77-degree temperature differential at the surface. DC, where we live, at Georgetown and work with the city, has taken to using bag taxes or bag fees, the fees on plastic bags that you get at the store, to support the introduction of green roofs and split the cost of homeowners along with stimulus funds. So now DC has actually in recent years surpassed the number of new green roofs installed, in part because of some of these innovative financing approaches. So I just have a couple of slides that mention some of the innovative financing, because I think the question that many of us are wrestling with is, we know we need to adapt, but it is a hard time for federal money, for states and local governments as well. So what are the funding mechanisms? DC, I mentioned the bag tax. Also, other places like Riverside, California, have used property-assessed clean energy assessments. Private sector money can come into those. The property assessment stays on the property even when it sells, because the efficiency benefits will continue long after that one resident leaves. So here are win-wins, because you reduce energy consumption, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you also help to reduce urban heat island impacts. And as we know, wetlands both store carbon and they also serve as an important buffer. Entergy, the utility down in Louisiana, with Tierra Resources, is partnering to restore some of these local wetlands that are, I think, valuable in their own right, obviously really beautiful ecosystems, really important to our nation's fisheries, as well as to buffer from the extreme events of climate change. And then the projects can be approved as carbon offsets, sold into the California Trading Program, for example, and the property owner can be compensated for the beneficial use of the land. So there are some interesting public-private partnership opportunities to try to promote some of these adaptation solutions, even in a difficult era in terms of financing. Finally, I just wanted to mention to you, we've got some toolkits that are free. They're available on our website. They look at sea level rise and coastal issues, as well as urban heat, both regulatory tools as well as incentive programs that are working in many jurisdictions that you might be interested in here. And these and other documents are available on an adaptation clearinghouse that we maintain that has not only our own work at the Georgetown Climate Center, but the work of many other institutions around the country as well, about 1,000 resources that you can search by sector or impact or where you're located. And hopefully you'll go to that and get more information. And with that, I just want to thank you.
And I'd like to invite Nikki Sheets up. Nikki? Great. And Dr. Beverly Wright.
Don't move as quickly as I used to. So my name is Nikki Sheets. I am at Thomas Edison State College here in New Jersey. I'm a member of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, and Jean threatened me that she threatened me in many ways and said, I had to say, and I'm proud to say, I'm also a member of the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance. And I'm here to introduce Dr. Beverly Wright to you. She is director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice at Dillard University, which is one of the preeminent environmental justice centers in the country. She is a founder of the environmental justice movement. She has taught at the University of New Orleans, Wake Forest, Xavier, and currently at Dillard. And on a more personal note, again, this is Jean's fault. She said I should personalize it a little bit. I met Beverly through a national EJ organization, and I want you to know that we all in the environmental justice community recognize Beverly as a senior EJ leader, not because of her age, but because of her experience and her expertise. And another thing you need to know is that Beverly can be, well, she's well-loved, and she can be very direct. Beverly will let you know what she's thinking. And I think it's interesting that she is both well-loved and direct. And I think that's because she's a very sincere person, a very caring person. And if she is being direct with you, she is doing it with love. And that's something we say a lot in the EJ community. When we want to tell you something you may not want to hear, we say it's with love. And that's pertinent also to what Beverly is going to talk about, at least in part today, because she is going to talk about, at least in part, climate adaptation and recovery from extreme weather events and the role that race may play in that. Beverly is a national expert on Katrina and extreme weather events, and we all know that our country and our society can be reluctant to talk about race, but certainly from an environmental justice perspective, we think that if we're going to recover correctly in New Jersey, we have to talk about race and Sandy. So as Beverly talks, if she says something that makes you a bit uncomfortable, just remember she's saying it with love. The New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance and the environmental justice community in New Jersey would like to thank you, Beverly, for coming and talking to us today.
Well, I'm not quite certain what you expect after that introduction. Power to the people, right? Something like that, I suspect. But I guess I hear people say all the time that Dr. Robert Bullitt is the father of environmental justice. Well, every book that he wrote, I was right there as well, and sometimes he was writing what I was saying. So I'm at least the auntie of it. I don't want to be the grandmother or anything like that, but I'm about the auntie, I guess, of EJ. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we do and my experiences related to Katrina. And I want to say again hello to Vicki. We go back a long ways. In fact, you see a couple of slides that are very similar as I move forward. So first of all, I'm a teacher, which makes it very difficult to start any conversation without doing what I'm about to do. But I'll do it very quickly, and that is, which way up? This tells my age every time. I'm not really savvy. The right. Okay, what's up? Nothing? Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, great. So for me, believe it or not, this whole interest in climate change started a long time before 2005. Because working with environmental justice organizations, a lot of them live fence line to petrochemical plants. And so when we began to put together this whole notion of our dependence on fossil fuel, how that was directly affecting them now with their communities being poisoned, with them being sick and having cancer, and then understanding that this also was connected to climate change, we saw these communities as being given a double whammy. So not only are they affected by fossil fuels, which contribute greatly to climate change, but the climate change events would hurt them and harm them more than others who did not live fence-line to these communities. So we went as far as going to The Hague, taking community members there for the climate summit, where one of our community members actually approached the Dutch queen, the owners of Shell Oil, and confronted her on these issues, and that was long before 2005. So A lot of people think communities are not aware. They are aware, and they are aware because of the environmental justice movement and all of the training that we do. So 2005, I think, was the time when everybody started thinking about climate change, and that was what happened. It brought us Katrina, one of the largest hurricanes that we had ever seen. I usually have slides going all the way through from 2005, 2006, 2007, but 2010, I think, was a time when we began to really focus our attention a bit more on Hurricane Katrina, on climate change, and other things were happening around the world as well. We were having earthquakes in Haiti, earthquakes in Chile. I can look down here. Flooding in France. And then it brings us to 2012, where, of course, we have Sandy. I'm not going to tell you about Sandy. You know about Sandy. But what I will talk about are some of Sandy's impacts and the fact that the people in Staten Island caught my eye very quickly because they were the ones who were complaining about not getting the kind of response that they felt they should have, and also comparing themselves in some ways to some of the things that happened to us in New Orleans, and that was where the most vulnerable actually were impacted more by the storm and did not receive the kind of help that they should have received. This goes a lot deeper than what you might imagine, but managing weather impacts is something that we've always had to deal with in society in general. The question for us, however, has always been one of equity. We already know that people around the world suffer more from the impacts of climate change than what we do. And they mostly have a smaller footprint. In other words, they're not causing all of these problems that we're having, but they are impacted more, especially in Africa and India. And when we think forward, what we also know is that there's a lot of uncertainty about how bad this is going to get, when it will happen. And so, although we can answer some of the questions, when we look at communities that are most vulnerable, we still don't know what impacts will occur for them. How bad will it get? You know, after Katrina, I didn't think it could get any worse than that, but it really can. It could be that the government never shows up. You know, not that it doesn't show up for weeks or months. It could be that they never show up. And I've been amazed at what I've seen going on in Congress, where you have people voting against aid, you know, after disaster. And it's always ironic that the people who do that eventually have to ask for aid, like the Republican senators from Oklahoma right now, who all voted against Sandy. So we call it the law of the big wheel. It eventually comes back around, and it might hit you. So we're looking at them, and I'm seeing them squirm, trying to get out of the questions that are being asked. Are you going to vote for aid to Oklahoma? Or will you vote against it in the way you voted against it for the victims of Sandy? Very interesting. So the differential effects of weather disasters is something that a lot of people were puzzled about, but for those of us who are in sociology and especially in political science and especially environmental justice already knew what would happen to people who are already vulnerable. They are already more exposed to toxins. Their health is more affected, you know, by pollution. And so when a disaster comes, they're also put in that same grid. So it's like living. It's like all of the old things. The poor pay more. You know, if you're poor and one thing happens to you, things seem to get worse. It's like needing to make a loan from the bank, but you need good credit. If you had good credit, you wouldn't need a loan from the bank, probably. So these things just tend to mount up. So when we look specifically at New Orleans, what we found out was that it was a largely African American and poor community that suffered mostly from Katrina, that couldn't find a way to get out after the storm. And a lot of people ask, why won't you evacuate? Why didn't they evacuate? Well, if you're poor, you get paid maybe once a week. You got to wait for your check. You need a credit card for a hotel. You need gasoline for cars. It's not just that you can just pack up and leave because a hurricane is coming. If you don't have the resources, you absolutely can't. And you have to depend on shelters. But this is what anticipating Katrina looked like. It was called contraflow. So after they told us you must leave, people were stuck on the interstate with no gasoline. I mean, the first time we evacuated was before Katrina. I had 2 elderly aunts. And I don't know if you all know what an old retired black school teacher is like, but they are a special breed. They're extremely particular, you know, and we had to travel with a dog and a cat, and these aunts were in their 80s. My second aunt just died at 93 last month. But putting those 2 old ladies in a car and driving for 18 hours just to get to Houston, Texas, was not an easy thing. And every time we decided to evacuate, we knew we had evacuated several times before Katrina. This is what people don't know, but we had. And when Katrina came, my aunt told me, I'm ready to just go home to glory. I'm not getting in that car. She did not want to leave because of the previous experiences. We really, literally had to almost force them into the car. It was an unbelievable experience to drive 8 hours to Baton Rouge, which is what, an hour away? And you're creeping along like this. A terrible, terrible experience. And the people who were mostly affected were, and I only put a few shots, were women and children, the elderly. Let's see. This picture amazes me because it looks like a third world country where people are running from a revolution or something with, you know, something on their back. That's New Orleans with people on I-10. And the children were taken to safety, but their parents didn't know where they were. So they were just trying to evacuate children. So you had all of these babies, no parents, no name tagging, parents looking for children, and then the scare was that there were child abusers, you know, crazy people collecting children. That turned out not to be true, but you could imagine what it was like with people saying, well, there's some crazy people, some sex offenders picking up children while you look for your children. It was really a crazy time. And I like to show this picture because this is when the government actually showed up with buses to get people out of the city, which also looks like people running from some wars someplace. And so Katrina left behind a lot of contamination. A lot of people don't talk about that. That was our focus. But there were so many oil spills. I'm not going to go through it. You can read it very quickly, underground storage tanks and so on. And there was a lot of debris, 22 million tons of debris. There were 350,000 automobiles, of which one was mine, that was left behind in the city of New Orleans. Most of the debris came out of New Orleans. And so then you ask the question, who recovers? And the early research basically showed that white people were recovering, black people weren't. The city was mostly black, but 80% of the people who recovered initially were white. So, you know, there were some who were and some who weren't, and that was strictly by race. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think this occurred. And it had a lot to do with the policy decisions that were made. Everybody knows the one about Mississippi versus Louisiana, where Mississippi decided they would take CBDG funds and ask for a moratorium of some kind where they could do away with the rules and then give each homeowner $150,000. Not Louisiana. They didn't think to ask that question, and so our governor, Blanco, who was pretty blank on the subject like that, didn't think to ask that particular question, and so they set up this unbelievable maze of a process where after almost a year, the people running the office to give money back had made like $8 million, and they had given 50 awards out. So all the money seemed to be going to the process rather than to the people. That's where we started. But the building plan, and Vicki showed you a picture of the initial building plan. This building plan was something that infuriated most of us. And there are a lot of reasons for that. When you look at this building plan, what you may not know is that you see the green circles. Is there a pointer on here? No? Yes, there is. this one. Is that it? Okay. So this is eastern New Orleans, where I live, right up in here. They have it here, but it's also kind of up in here. This circle, the first circle, is my neighborhood. The first circle is my neighborhood. In fact, I live about 3 blocks from Lake Pontchartrain. So this is Lake Pontchartrain here, so I'm right up in here. So this appears on the front page of the Advocate newspaper in Baton Rouge, where a lot of us work. My phone started ringing at about 6:30 in the morning. It didn't stop. By 12 o'clock, we were all in New Orleans. I've never driven that quickly to New Orleans in my whole life from Baton Rouge. When we got there, the amazing thing was that the whole front row was filled with Vietnamese people. We were like stunned because, you know, Vietnamese people don't raise hell. It's sort of against their culture, you know, to raise hell. African Americans, on the other hand, we're pretty well known for that. But to see all of these people sitting on the front row when we came in, so the room ended up being mostly Vietnamese in the front, first few rows, and then just packed with mostly black people, but there were a lot of white people there as well, asking questions about this because somebody decided that where I live was going to become a green space. I have nothing against green spaces, but you don't turn my house into one based on what and by whom. The other thing that was so difficult, a lot of people don't know this, but the city of New Orleans is older than the United States of America. It's been there a long time. And it was the home of a lot of what we call free coloreds. And so my heritage goes back a very long time. I can count 8 generations in the city of New Orleans, mothers and fathers, not just one side, 8 generations, because we go a long ways back in the old 7th Ward and old 6th Ward. So this property out here, a lot of this property was owned by African Americans. The population was more black than white, blacks and Vietnamese. This is what was inundated. And so the areas that they were talking about turning into green spaces and not rebuilding were all where the water was. And I'll show you the next slide, which is very interesting. Oh. Which way? These things don't like me. Why is it moving? Ah, not just me. You did it? Okay, great. This next slide was called Neighborhood Rebuilding Immediate Opportunity Areas. So the place where they were going to put all of the rebuilding funds were in areas with little or no flood damage. So, and this is marked here. So that meant out where I live, they were going to do nothing. Most of the places were uptown by Tulane University. And I have some other really startling maps, but I didn't have time to show you. And then they managed to keep the areas where the universities were. So you had UNO, where I used to teach, which is, that's Southern University, that's the black school. And then you have University of New Orleans, which is the predominantly white school. So this was an area that they wanted to immediately repopulate and rebuild. Then when you go in these other areas, there's a medical center here, but you notice that mostly uptown, all of this area, that hardly got any water. That's where all of the money was being redirected. So the rebuilding money was going to places that were not hit. So that meant that all of us who were flooded out, I had 8 feet of water in my house. Everybody in my family lost everything. We had one family member whose house didn't go under. She lived in Gentilly on the Gentilly Ridge. So her house was sitting there, 2 of them, and everybody around her was underwater. She was feeling pretty lonely at a certain point. But this was the plan, and this is what brought us to the city very angry about what was going on. How do you explain this, that the only areas you want to rebuild are where mostly white people live, and some of them wealthy white people, while you leave those of us who were affected to get no money, and the only reason the money was coming was because people were hit? I'm going to have to direct this. Okay, so they usually tell you, although we were able to push back on that, they usually tell you the unwritten plan, you can tell that by following the money. So we decided, okay, this is going on. We pushed that back. They went back on it. But what else is happening? Next slide. So I wanted to tell you this first. There is a fund that comes out of FEMA, the hazard mitigation money. That money was supposed to be given directed to hurricane victims, people whose houses went under. But there's some guideline with the hazard mitigation money that says that if you've had at least 2 claims, flood claims, this money is put aside to mitigate hazards. So the problem was the areas that flooded with the hurricane generally didn't get flood water. Our streets and everything didn't flood during normal times. It only flooded because of the hurricane. So the hazard mitigation money that came in went to the Broadmoor area of the city. And when we reviewed the data on the areas hardest hit, it wasn't Broadmoor. What I saw in Broadmoor was a lot of, what do you call those really expensive refrigerators? Zero, Sub-Zero, they Sub-Zeros outside, things like that. But that's not the area that had 8 feet of water in it. For the most part, it was Gentilly, it was the Lower Ninth Ward, it was New Orleans East. The hazard mitigation money went mostly in this area. And next slide. I wish I had it right here. Oh, good. Okay. So, and this was a map that we sneaked out of City Hall. They didn't know we had it. We had an inside-outside person that basically showed us that the hazard mitigation money went in these little clusters, was mostly here, the Broadmoor area. And so some of these people got as much as $450,000 to raise their house and to fix it. They didn't get the water from Hurricane Katrina. They did not. So the monies were going in another direction. Now, they attempted to rectify that a little later, but I'll show you how hard it was to get there. Next slide. So what we did was a GIS analysis looking at recovery money and all the planning we had. We had so many planning committees. We were like an expert on community planning and focus groups and all of that kind of stuff. So after all of that was done, we decided that we would take that data, deal with a ranking, because every community ranked what they wanted done first in their community, and then look how the money was spent and where it was spent. And what we found was really interesting. Next slide. I keep pressing this. So you look at these are the planning districts. So this map doesn't do very much just looking at it for you, but there are numbers. Next slide, then I'll show you the next slide, which should be next to this so you could see the amount of money spent in each planning district and where they were. But what I want you to look at is 1 and 2, which basically represents the CBD area and uptown that got the majority of the money. New Orleans East and where the areas that were mostly flooded are more on this end, where the less money was spent. Next slide. Then we did a comparison, and this is what was really interesting. We looked at majority white and majority African American planning districts. And what we found was that there were 4 majority white and 8 majority black planning districts. When you look at the bars, you see that the orange group, the whites got more money. It doesn't look so bad. It looked like they're almost even. But when you look at the planning district, you see the difference where white people in 4 planning districts got more money than black people in 8 planning districts, and blacks make up the majority of the city, which basically shows what we thought would happen. The unwritten plan was put in place because they basically were freezing us out, of not allowing us to have certain amenities And those amenities I will talk about later. Next slide. So, before we go into all of that, and I know I got to talk a little faster, but before we go into all of that, one of our responses was this project called A Safe Way Back Home. Because what was basically happening was in New Orleans East, where we weren't getting any help, no street lights, no grocery stores, no medical, no anything. And if we didn't get back home, that would never happen. So we started this project. We have a National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences worker training program. We've been doing it now for almost 20 years. We work with the steel workers, the laborers, and so on. We train young men and women how to clean up exactly what was going on in the city. HAZWOPER training, asbestos, lead, mold, basic construction. So in talking with the steel workers, everybody was saying, how can we help you? I said, well, I think we should do a demonstration project to show the government what they need to do to help homeowners get back in their homes, and we did that. They agreed. I remember we had been drinking quite a bit when we made that decision to move forward with this project, and as we got into it, I said we must have been drunk because it turned out to be quite a bit of work, but this is I call this the Safeway Back Home gang. They're all steel workers. We're the ones that sat around and came up with this, and next slide. It was a huge project. That's my house in the back. But what we had was about 280 volunteers of young people from all over the country who came. They suited up. They went through the training. You see them suiting up, going through training and suiting up here. Next slide. FEMA was involved. OSHA was involved in the project. We actually removed 6 inches of topsoil. We put clean river sand and then planted with sod, new sod on the houses. But first the houses had to have been remediated for mold. We worked with the people in the block on that. Then everything was hosed down before we did this. Because there was a soot of some kind everywhere that was highly contaminated, the dust that was all over the blocks, all over the houses. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, and you can see the volunteers. I like this slide because, see the guy in the front? He seems to be directing, but it's the woman who's pushing the wheelbarrow. That was always really interesting to me that was happening. So the sod arrived. We had monies from some of the volunteer groups, the Kellogg Foundation and some others that gave us money. And we began cleaning up the whole block. It took maybe 2 weekends for us to do that. Next slide. And that's my house. That's the way it looked before, that's during, and then after. The only thing's missing is that I didn't have a front door, but I did get my front door. Next slide. And then this is what the block looked later. We were clean and green. The grass grew beautifully. People in my neighborhood began doing the same thing. We had training classes in Baton Rouge and New Orleans showing them what to do, how to get it done, and they did it on their own. They did it with no help from anyone and got back in their houses. Next slide. We had another project with the Kellogg Foundation where we traveled to Birmingham, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, Houston, Texas, with training classes for community members who wanted to return home, telling them how to return safely, providing gear for them to wear to clean up, all the information they needed to get back home, and we assisted them in cleaning up their houses. Next slide. We also trained contractors. They were trained in how do you go into a contaminated house to work, building a safe room inside of the house where you go in and out. And this was some of the training with the contractors, outside, showing them everything that they should do to get back safely. Next slide. And the policy decisions affected all of these areas: housing, public education, recreational, infrastructure, food security, and medical facilities. Next slide. I wish I had it because I could move faster if I could. So there were inequities. What's happened in the city of New Orleans is almost historical. New Orleans is in the deep South. It was a slave state. It went through Jim Crow, segregation, discrimination, and that causes what I call racialized space. So it's very segregated. You have certain areas that are all black, certain areas that are mostly white. It's hard to be all white in New Orleans if it's predominantly black. The interesting thing is that in my other research, I found that even when in a city like New Orleans, where the majority was black, and there were sections where you had a lot of whites, but you still had blacks, white people managed to live in the cleanest areas. Like I couldn't find a TRI facilities, none of that where white people lived. But where we lived, whether we were wealthy or poor, we had all of the dirty stuff. So I said there's some secret communication that goes on with white people, you know, where they know what we don't know. Because if I had known, I wouldn't have moved there. But they move out, we move in, and stuff is coming that we don't know about. We have to get better. And my answer is that every black person needs to have at least one good white friend. Really, I'm serious. It's my white girlfriends that would call me and say, Beverly, did you know? I'm like, no, I didn't know that. I'm like, my God, I even found out they had a special flood insurance that was never offered to me. And so with their houses, they had a deluxe package or something where they got more money than what I did. I'm like, so Natalie, how did you find, I don't know, my insurance guy told me. I said, well, everything your insurance guy tells you, you come back and tell me, so I can then tell my friends. So there is this network that we're not a part of. I think black people know that. There's some things we just don't know and nobody's telling us. So if you have a good black friend, talk to them more often. It'll be good for their health, for one thing. So you have these lingering institutional constraints created and perpetuated by racialized places that have hindered progress towards equitable recovery. I think that's in one of my books, one of the lines I wrote in my book. Next slide. So inequity in housing. Next slide. Okay. This may sound really strange, but I have to take my glasses off to tell you this. In the Deep South, I don't know if it's here in New Jersey, but where black people live, the value of the property is less than where white people live. I have a beautiful house on a man-made lake, but in Metairie, where white people live, they could have a little tiny house that will cost more than my house. They'll value it more, right? Okay, so now you deal with this type of system that regardless of how beautiful your house is, how big it is, it's not valued in the same way as white housing. You would think that it has to do with maybe amenities or something, you know, more greenery. It doesn't. It's strictly based on race. That the mortgage companies and the people who deal with, what do you call the people who sell houses, this is how they set this up. So move forward quickly to the Road Home program. The Road Home program was to assist people in getting back into their houses. Well, a terrible thing happened on the way home. If you were African American, you lived in an African American neighborhood, you got a lot less to rebuild your house than a white person in a little 3-bedroom shack, just a small 3-bedroom house, because of the ways that the houses were devalued. So when you got the money, the market value that they gave your house wasn't enough to rebuild your house. But the market value for white people was enough to rebuild their houses. So white people got a lot more money to rebuild their houses than what black people did. Along comes the suit. The judge agrees that there is some discrimination. They look at the way the money is divvied out and decides, okay, we're going to stop all expenditures as to this particular grant until we can figure this out. We need to put some money aside for the lower-income people who didn't get the money they needed to rebuild their house. Long story short, that was a long fight. We won it. And black people then, they were all African American, by the way, some low income, got additional money so that they could move back in their house. Next slide. I told you that because I don't have time to go through this. What is discrimination? Next slide. Okay. We won the suit. Next slide. We won the suit again. Next slide. I've already told you this. I was trying to do it quickly. And what is this? Okay, now this is something that shows up in the middle. It's really slides in the wrong place. But the public housing situation in New Orleans is unbelievable. In fact, the first public housing ever was in the city of New Orleans. It came out of the Tulane University School of Social Work. So the first housing project was in New Orleans. So we had the largest concentration of housing projects of any city per capita in the United States. That was New Orleans. We also had a lot of poor people because you all come there and have fun, and most of us are waiters and we don't make any money. And we can't get them to raise anything. We can't get them to raise the minimum wage. So people love New Orleans because you can have a Go Cup. You know, when you leave the restaurant, you can drink on the street. You can eat very cheaply. But the people who work in that city are working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. So we have a huge, very poor population. So we began tearing down housing projects. Many of them were built out of bricks and mortar. You know, there was really nothing wrong with them except the plumbing had to be redone. But it was an opportunity to get rid of large concentrations of poor people. Next slide. And what basically happened was we were allowed to not follow the regulation that at one time said for every low-income house you destroy, you have to replace. So you can't knock down without replacing. They were allowed to knock down without replacing. They reduced the concentration of low-income housing, and we have a 22,000 waiting list for public housing right now. That displaced large numbers of people who are in Baton Rouge coming home every summer trying to get back home. It also changed the political climate because you completely destroyed, by removing 8,000, 9,000 people at one time, political district, councilmanic districts. So New Orleans, that was city council majority black, 5-2, 5 African Americans, 2 whites. We now have 5 whites and 2 African Americans, although the city is still majority black. And so by moving people out, shifting, reducing numbers, they were able to completely take over the political structure of the city. So we have a white mayor, who I happen to like, and we have 5 white city council people and 2 blacks. And if you don't think that makes a difference, you are wrong. Everything we try to push, things have been happening to us at warp speed. We're seeing things changing, and the city changing. Next slide. Talked about that. Next slide. Next slide. The settlement. Okay, so then we have other inequities. Next slide. Something as simple, and I like to show this picture because New Orleans had one of the best park systems in the whole country because they were trying so hard to be separate but equal. Remember that? So because of the separate but equal law, in our neighborhoods, every neighborhood had a park with a pool. And, we had NARD, which was great for programming for children. We were heralded at one time as being one of the best in the country. After Katrina, everything was decimated. And I was really struck by this because these public-private partnerships you talked about, Vicki, they started them in relationship to recreational facilities. And where did they go? They went uptown to a park that wasn't even affected. And they redid it and put all of these things, and this was right after Katrina. Things have changed. You know, we raised a lot of hell, made a lot of noise about it, so now they're moving along and doing more. But in the very beginning, this is the way it was, and it would have stayed like that had people not voiced their anger and their disgust with the way that they were catering to people who have and not dealing with those who didn't. Next slide. Okay, and the biggest travesty of all to me is the New Orleans public school system. That should be OPSB, not OSPB. Our school system has gone through a number of things. I'm just going to talk because it'll take too long to show all of the slides. But our school system went under, I call it receivership. And this is happening in a lot of places where the state takes over failing schools. Now, if you're in Louisiana, it's a failing state. So you imagine seeing your school system go under the state, and you say, what? You know, we're a state that's always in trouble, but it did. And the schools were under the Bessie Board. And we had one school district. Next slide. Let me see if I can put it more in order. All right, so there was this particular act where it made it easier for them to take over the school system. There were several injustices in that. The state took over the school system, but they had a particular number that the city had to reach in order to not lose, so you wouldn't lose your school. But that number was just for New Orleans. The rest of the state, that's Baton Rouge and all these other little places, had as many failing schools as New Orleans did. But the only schools that were taken over were the schools in the city of New Orleans. That's a big suit going on right now as well. They also received a large grant to cover teachers' pay while we were going through Katrina. All of the teachers in Chalmette, St. Bernard, Jefferson Parish received payment. The money was held from the New Orleans public teachers alone, and they fired every public teacher in the public school system. They've been fighting for their jobs ever since. They will win the suit, but the objective was won, because once you deny people jobs and they have to go elsewhere, you disperse a community. Our middle class in the African American community, the largest middle class we have are school teachers. So if you take over the public school system, which is one of the #1 employers of any city, you disperse all of their people. That also deals with contracts, small and minority business contracts, all of that's gone. And then you give us a system, next slide. Continue, I talked about that. Teachers protesting, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is what our school system looks like now. We're a city of less than 500 people. Now the majority of our schools are charter schools, which everybody hails as being this and that. Charter schools for us has been a disaster in spite of what they say about the success of their schools. In our charter schools, you have selective admission. If every public school under the old system had been able to get rid of every child that couldn't read or didn't function well, they would have a great school system too. But now the charter schools have done that. The second thing that they've done is they hire Teach for America teachers because they're cheaper. So you hire the Teach for America student right out of Yale, Harvard, whatever, and you give them 5 weeks of training. Then you put them in a classroom with my children, right? The school system is about 98% African American. You put them, no other experience but 5 weeks. So why do we have departments of education? As a teacher, I would be insulted. Would you take a chemist? Would you take a sociologist like me, give me 5 weeks of training in chemistry, and then put me somewhere to do some serious chemistry experiment or something that deals with chemistry? So what makes people think that a young person right out of school with 5 weeks of training can teach my children? They will not teach my children. I would make certain that my children didn't have an inexperienced teacher in this big experiment going on. That's what's happening, and the majority of our schools now are charter schools. And children are pushed out, so all of this stuff, the hype you see about how well we're doing, don't believe it. You can come and see me, and I will show you the actual data. They have taken over schools because there's so much money in schools. It's unbelievable how much money there is in public education. I'm being told I need to stop, and I will. I wish I could use if I could move these slides, I could do it quickly. Move next slide very quickly. Let me see what else I was showing. Next one, quick. I live in New Orleans East. We have one supermarket for 70,000 people. One. They showed the dots show before and after. We didn't have very many before, but since Katrina, now we have one. Next slide, quickly. Next slide. And I'm going to stop here. I have a lot more, but I don't have enough time. I knew this wouldn't be enough time, but thank you for listening.
Please join me in thanking two great women for joining us here today. Thank you, Vicki and Beverly. Before we let you go to your breakout sessions, just a fast reflection. Today you heard some folks from outside of New Jersey talk about climate preparedness and adaptation, opportunities and challenges and experiences dealing with our urban cities, with our coastal resources, with water, with transportation, with built infrastructure, with natural resources, talking about vulnerable populations. And it's really a reflection of the work that we're trying to do with the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance, where we have a group of open-minded and dedicated folks who reflect our public health community, our EJ community, our business community, water resources work, a wide diversity of folks who have come together to speak with a common voice, recognizing that regardless of what you think is causing climate change, that there is a need to prepare and adapt for it in terms of the impacts to all of those aspects of the quality of life that we all enjoy and love here in New Jersey, our home. So if you don't know a lot about the Climate Adaptation Alliance, there's a flyer in your folder that gives you some background. We hope that you'll join our email list. And one of the things that we're working on now, which is very reflective of some of the things that our speakers have talked about, is we're deep in the middle of a relatively deliberative process to develop policy recommendations for the state of New Jersey on all of those sector areas. We're working with a lot of partners, many of you who are here. We have a lot of financial support to do this work from many of you who are here. And as part of that, we're working with stakeholder groups in all of those jurisdictions in order to develop a set of comprehensive recommendations. So the best way to keep in touch with what we're doing is through our website. With that, we're going to break you into three. You can choose one. Breakout sessions. They will run till about 4 o'clock, and then we're going to come back for a reception here where you'll have an opportunity to chat and get to know folks and nosh a bit. For those of you who want to participate in the Preparing Our Residents session, that will be in the George Cook Room, which is just around the corner here on the first floor. Preparing Our Infrastructure will stay here in the multipurpose room, and Preparing Our Communities will be in room 202, which is just up on the second floor. So what we would ask you to do is to just head up to your breakout session. There's going to be a number of speakers who are going to be talking in very rapid fashion, and an opportunity for lots of questions. There's some snacks still out in the hallway, and we'll see you all here at 4 o'clock.